From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Ahead today, K-State's Brian Briggeman will talk about trends in farmer cooperative grain storage in Kansas. This based on a new survey of cooperative managers, indicating the degree of cooperative consolidation in the state over the past few years and the simultaneous growth in grain storage capacity. Then the latest edition of FSA Coffee Talk over from the Farm Service Agency. Todd Barrows will talk about the new updates to the CFAP 1 and 2 programs, and he'll share information on newly announced aid for you grain producers under the Quality Loss Assistance Program. Later then, K-State's Charlie Lee is back in for his weekly wildlife management segment. That and more ahead on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
While the CDC urges you to avoid close contact, like hugging or shaking hands, there are other non-physical ways to say hello. Wave, wink, use sign language, salute, smile, give the peace sign, throw up an air high five, do jazz hands. Remember, stay a minimum of 6 feet or 2 arms length away from others, and stay home if you can. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're tuned into Agriculture Today, our Tuesday edition. Welcome once more. For openers, a glance to new information out of the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center here at Kansas State University. That center just put forth its survey results on grain storage of Kansas farmer cooperatives, trends in that storage in volume and in number of delivery locations. Along with us once more is the director of that center, Brian Briggeman, to share this information. And Brian, you've been looking at this particular aspect of farmer cooperative business in Kansas, for the last few years?
Yeah, that's correct, Eric. So back in 2016 was when we set out at the Capper Center to really maybe try to do a better job of tracking the different trends within the state of Kansas for farmer co-ops and to really see how the industry is evolving, because it's pretty interesting how it has all changed. So if you go back in the 50s, at the peak, we had 364 farmer cooperatives in the state of Kansas, and today we have 62. And as I defined a farmer co-op, I should say that it's where the management is located, right? So we have different types of co-ops working together and coming together in different ways, but we just look at where the headquarters for a farmer co-op is where the management resides. So knowing that consolidation and that trend, we wanted to be able on an annual basis to be able to see how things have changed and evolved. And one of the ways that we do that, and you can see this map that we put together, and we started it back in 2016. Think of it like a starburst map, right? So that farmer co-op headquarter that I said, right, where we drop a pin right down in the middle of it on this map, and it's a live map. You can interact with it, zoom in, do the satellite view, all that stuff. You drop a pin where the co-op headquarters is located, and then we go to where an upright grain storage location is at. So if you look at maybe some of our co-ops that are larger in the state that have, 15 or more different grain storage locations, you can just imagine from that pin just a bunch of lines being drawn out to it. So you can go to our website and see that at accc.ksu.edu. But it's just a way to since 16, we've been doing that each year. But this year, we wanted let's make sure we have all the storage capacity properly counted for. So that's what we did in the survey, and to make sure we had the locations correct.
So to gather that information, not only on the quote headquarters, but those satellite locations and the volume of grain storage that it all adds up to. How did you get at that? By survey directly?
Yeah. So there's multiple ways to do it. Of course, we have the state and federal warehouse license information that you can get access to. We also have other sources as well. So we do a lot of work on the front end to make sure we have it as close as we can. Going to the co-op's webpage is actually a really good resource as well to make sure we have it as close as we can. And then we constructed a survey. The Arthur Capper Cooperative Center, we're a public-private partnership between K-State and the Kansas Cooperative Council. And just that partnership and close connection we have with farmer co-ops allowed us to conduct this survey and to get them all back so that we have a good reflection of not only the upright grain storage, but this year we also asked about bunker space and flat storage space as well.
Because that's become more than commonplace in recent years with abundant crops in certain occasions anyway, when it's wet.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Eric. That's one of the things that's really amazing to see from just 2016 to 2020. One, the amount of additional upright grain storage that has happened in the state of Kansas. So for co-ops, specifically, looking at the 2 times frame for surveys, that number has increased by a little over 60 million bushels. And also know that we have fewer locations, too, because we've had, kind of a consolidation within that. And then some facilities are worn out and they're not useful anymore or not used. So you actually have fewer locations, but much more storage capacity on the upright side. But also bunkers are a lot more prevalent. I think if you drive across the state of Kansas, given whatever time we're looking at harvest, you can see a number of grain piles that are out there. And then also, too, we have some flat storage. Although the flat storage is a much smaller percentage overall, upright is by far the biggest, then bunker, and then much smaller is flat.
And just as a note here, when we look at the grain locations and some of these larger cooperatives that are rather dominant in those numbers, you get into some sizable systems here in the 30 to 40 site range.
Right. Yeah. So we do have, just some co-ops in the state that, like I said, that 15 or more locations. We've got a few of those. But also, too, if you even look in Kansas, we have 11 co-ops that are single location co-ops. But even still, if you get into what the storage capacity that they have at that single location, is still sizable. So when you take it all together, right, you look at the entire cooperative system, it amounts to about 48% of total grain storage capacity in the state of Kansas is tied to a co-op. And you think about that from single location to very large location co-ops. We represent the country elevator system is the way I like to think about it. So it's very important, pretty prominent within the state. And I can make those statements because we did more than just look at just the co-ops, right? With the surveys, I have a close connection with those managers, so I can work closely with them to get those reporting. But in all the other public sources as well, we can go find the non-co-op storage, as well as on-farm storage.
And those are trending up likewise, you say?
Yeah, they most certainly are. You're exactly right, Eric. So, I said the 60 million bushel, which is about on upright for co-ops, it's right at about a 12% increase since 2016. If we look at non-cooperatives, so privates, multinationals, that number has increased on upright storage about 14%. And then if we look at on-farm storage, that number has gone up as well. A little bit smaller increase, about 7%, but everything is trending up. And there are, some really good reasons for why we see more grain storage in the state.
And those would have to do with our capacity to produce grain.
Right.
Consistently improving through genetics and otherwise.
Absolutely. From a technology standpoint, we're able to grow just so many more bushels on an acre of ground than ever before. And that trend just continues to go up. We're more efficient harvesting it, right? Speed. We can get it out of the field very quickly and need to dump it. So we need to be able to dump quickly and have plenty of storage available. Also, too, in Kansas, the commodity mix has changed as well. We grow a lot of corn today, and that really has trended up where we have a lot more of those bushels out there. So there's just been a really strong need for cooperatives, especially, to be more efficient, right? You need to be more efficient in order to handle the amount of grain that is out there in the state of Kansas.
And that really is what this work illustrates in full, that trend toward efficiency and gaining those efficiencies for the betterment of the cooperative, for the betterment of its members as well.
Absolutely. For farmers, co-ops were put together, back in the early 1900s to kind of satisfy a common need. There was something that was needed, and then back then it was a place in order to get competitive prices for the grain to sell. Today, there's still a need, right? You still need to add that value to that farmer owner, and one of those ways to do it, at least piece that we focused on in the survey is through that speed and space and availability for that grain storage.
The next logical question is, will this consolidation plateau, or will we see more of it ahead? We deal with that question about every time we talk cooperative.
Yeah.
You're thinking?
Well, if you look at that trend overall since the 50s, obviously it's down, right? And we continue. When we did this survey back in 2016, there were 81 co-ops at the time. So, today we're at 62. So just even in that short amount of time, we've seen consolidation. My guess, we'll continue to see that. New and different ways for working together to add value back to those farmers. But, that trend, if you look at it over time, it has slowed somewhat. So will there be consolidation? I would imagine so. Where that number will end up, I don't know for sure. You look to the north of us in Nebraska, and they have just over 20 co-ops in their state, right? So it's much smaller than what we have here in Kansas. But, if you're going to pin me down, Eric, to say, well, what's that number? Well, I don't have the number.
Nobody does.
No, but I do think that the trends are there. You see from managers retiring, from boards having discussions back and forth with how can we, be more efficient? How can we add, value back to our farmer owners? So I think those discussions are always ongoing. So, just looking at the past, I think is kind of a bit of a guide. We would expect to see a little bit of that, consolidation trend to happen and to continue. But where exactly, not for sure where we'll end up.
Well, to get a perspective on the state of farmer cooperatives and the grain storage locations that they operate in Kansas, do see that interactive map that Brian referred to a little while ago. It's at the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center site at K-State, accc.ksu.edu. Brian, thanks for going over this with us right here.
Thanks, Eric.
He's the director of the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center here at Kansas State University, Brian Briggeman, on trends in grain storage at Kansas farmer cooperatives. Our topic on this part of Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
We're back now on Agriculture Today, and we're around to time once more to hear from your Farm Service Agency state headquarters for Kansas. It's a segment we call FSA Coffee Talk. Again with us is an agricultural program specialist with the FSA state headquarters, Todd Barrows. Todd, good to have you back again, and we will talk about the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program Phases 1 and 2. Still some things going on in that arena, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. And with the waning hours of the past administration, there was what we call CFAP 1 and 2 Part 3 came out. And so we wanted to just share some of those guidelines with our listeners, as well as talk about the Quality Loss Assistance Program that was recently announced as well.
Well, let's talk about those in order. CFAP 1, the first go-round with, to put it this way, an upgrade. Is that correct?
Yeah. In Part 3 of CFAP 1, they're doing a top-up program payment for our swine producers. That payment is going to be $17 per head, and it's based on the previous head inventory that producers were certified to owning between April the 16th and May 15th of 2020 on their CFAP 1 application. The good news about this to the listeners is, because it's a top-up payment, it takes no action on the producer. Everything will be handled internally because we're using off the numbers on that first CFAP 1 application. And so, again, they'll just get an additional payment of $17 per head. The other part that I want to talk about or move into transition is the CFAP 2 Part 3. Wheat, corn, sorghum, soybeans, those payments were issued, and one of the computations had to deal with the producer's either APH yield for 2020, or if they didn't have an APH yield, it was based on the 85% of the 2019 Ark County benchmark yield. Well, now what they came back to that program for two specific groups of producers. One being, if a producer had a substantial beneficial interest, or we call that an SBI, in a primary policyholder's crop insurance policy because of transfer of coverage or right to an indemnity, that producer was initially paid based on 85% of the Ark County benchmark yield. Now we will retroactively go back and actually pay based upon the APH, or that producer's 2020 APH with that transfer of coverage. And we have a list of those producers. So the county offices shall be contacting producers on who that will affect. But again, just to make sure producers are aware that provisions are out there. And then if you remember, I said there's two groups. The other group, if you were an SBI, or substantial beneficial interest again, to a primary policyholder with crop insurance, and you have a landlord-tenant relationship, or you're in a joint operation or general partnership with the primary policyholder for that insurance coverage or your crop insurance policy, you also will get a bump up in your payment from the 85% of 2019 Ark County benchmark yield to 100% of that benchmark yield. And again, county offices have been provided a list of those affected producers. They are in the process of notifying those producers to let them know that they'll need to come in and do modifications to their applications and to get this additional payment.
Todd, there were some other provisions that emerged as latter changes here affecting contract growers?
Yeah, there was some provisions that came out, again, under Part 3 of CFAP 2, dealing with now making eligibility for contract growers for poultry and the swine industry. Those contract growers would receive a payment based on their 1099 income from 2019 tax year, monies received under their contract agreement to grow that livestock. It's just for poultry production as well as swine production, and contract growers must provide a copy of their most current contract grower agreement prior to payments being issued. Producers have till February the 26th. So if you're a contract grower for poultry or swine, you have till February the 26th to contact your local county office and start that process of enrolling under that Part 3 of the CFAP 2 program.
And you brought up something else earlier called the Quality Loss Program, and it's a form of assistance here. What's that about, Todd?
Yeah, so quality loss assistance, Eric, is the final leg of crop losses that producers suffered or may have suffered under the 2018-2019 crop years. And we covered the production side of that under what was known as the WIP Plus program. Now we're going back and we're looking at covering price losses due to quality affected by the same primary disaster events. And so the first criteria is you had to have a primary disaster event. And in Kansas, we're looking at drought, and that would be a D3 in the U.S. Drought Monitor or greater. Or it could be excessive moisture, flood, snowstorm, or a tornado. But if you suffered a quality loss that affected the price of your crop based on a primary disaster event, and that quality loss is more than 5% damage or loss in price, then you may be eligible to receive additional assistance under the QLA program. Now, there's several keys to that, and one of those keys is being that you must provide a copy of your grading factors based upon the crop grading standards within 30 days of harvest. So the crop had to be graded within 30 days of harvest in order to be eligible to determine the quality loss due to an eligible weather event.
Now, how the losses are defined, pivotal here, because some losses may not qualify for this assistance.
Right. It has to be something that is outside of the producer's control. So you could have a loss that happened after harvest, such as insect festation in storage, or loss during storage, drifting herbicides, high moisture content, or reducing cost because of the moisture content. Those are all what we call mitigatable by the producer. Therefore, those are ineligible causes of loss. So what we're looking at when we're talking about grading standards particular to the crop, we're going to be looking at like low test weights, broken or damaged kernels, low protein. I know I talked to a producer the other day that had some aflatoxin in their corn. So those are the normal standards or grading factors that we're going to look at. And if that's tied to a cost loss, then they could be eligible. And I want to switch gears because I know we have some livestock forage producers out there, and I don't want to leave them out because also we'll do a quality on those forage crops as well, although that's based on a nutritional value versus on a grading standard. So, again, quality losses must be supported by a verifiable grading documentation and the total dollar loss that they sustained. Forage crops that were grazed are not eligible. It had to be mechanically harvested. And again, the testing had to be by a licensed laboratory or a land-grant university within 30 days of harvest.
So those are the particulars on the Quality Loss Assistance Program. How much time do producers have to take advantage of this, Todd?
We have a fairly narrow window on this program as well, Eric, so that's why we want to get this information out. But sign-up started on January the 6th, and it runs through March 5th. So when you look at number of days, work days between now and March 5th, it's a pretty short window.
And you say one final reminder about an important piece of farm program business. Producers shouldn't lose sight of this.
Absolutely. We're currently in the final days of the 2021 ARC PLC program enrollment. When I say final days, it's because there is 29 work days left between now and March 15th, which is the deadline to enroll in that 2021 ARC PLC program. Currently, as of today, Kansas is 61% enrolled. So if you're one of those producers that's holding out, call the local office, get on their appointment book just to make sure that you can get that enrolled and make sure that you're in the program for the 2021 program year.
And just as a footnote to that, you should take full advantage of what K-State Agricultural Economics is offering in as far as decision-making tools for your ARC and PLC choice. That's at agmanager.info. Look into that. Well, Todd, as always, good information to pass along to producers right here. Always something new happening with our farm programs in Kansas, and we appreciate your time telling us all about this.
Thanks, Eric.
Todd Barrows, Agricultural Program Specialist with the Farm Service Agency, State Headquarters for Kansas. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State Research and Extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today continues here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you, and on to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. House Subcommittee has launched an investigation into COVID outbreaks at meatpacking plants owned by Tyson Foods, JBS, and Smithfield Foods, as well as the response from the Occupational Health and Safety Administration. Since the beginning of the pandemic last year, more than 50,000 meatpacking plant workers have tested positive for COVID. More than 270 died from the virus, according to this House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis. Yesterday, the chairman of that committee, Representative James Clyburn of South Carolina, asked for additional information from executives at the three companies, as well as from OSHA Deputy Assistant Secretary James Frederick. In a letter to Frederick, Clyburn said the Trump administration didn't do enough to hold meatpacking plants accountable for employee safety. Now, the Vice President of Communications for the North American Meat Institute, Sarah Little, said that meat and poultry producers have taken measures across the industry to secure workers. She said that more than $1.5 billion in comprehensive protections instituted since the spring, in her words, successfully cut average case rates for meat and poultry workers 5 times lower in December than they were in May, while infections rocketed up by 9 times for the general population in the same period. Again, that was Little's statement. At the end of last week, the Biden administration announced a worker safety guidance for the industry. Little said that the Biden guidance was similar to the efforts already implemented by the meat and poultry industry since the beginning of the pandemic. In those letters to Tyson, JBS, and Smithfield, Clyburn requested a bevy of documents from the companies due February the 15th. Bipartisan legislation has been introduced to create new opportunities for cattle producers and processors to market beef products, introduced by U.S. Representative Dusty Johnson of South Dakota and Henry Cuellar of Texas. The Direct Interstate Retail Exemption for Certain Transactions, or DIRECT Act of 2021, would allow retail quantities of meat processed under state inspection to be sold across state lines through e-commerce, providing beef producers and local processors alike with more options to market to consumers directly. Currently, many states have state meat and poultry inspection programs approved by the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service, and at least equal to standards under the Federal Meat Inspection Act. Under the existing framework, however, state-inspected products can only be sold interstate if approved to do so under the Cooperative Interstate Shipping Program. This act would amend the retail exemption to allow processors to sell normal retail quantities across state lines to consumers. The nation's dairy herd is expanding, but producers are being cautious about it, according to the latest numbers from the USDA. The USDA's Gary Crawford has more.
When it comes to the nation's dairy sector, the latest USDA cattle inventory report shows a definite
upward movement in the herd.
USDA livestock analyst Shale Shagam, the report showing the number of dairy cows as of January 1st at 9.44 million head. That's about 1% more than a year ago. Shagam says the reason for the expansion is obvious, pretty obvious.
What we have seen is, towards the end of last year and to the beginning of this year, some strengthening of milk prices from sort of the very low prices we saw during April and June at the height of the pandemic when the industry was still trying to restructure itself.
And so Shagam says it looks like there is what he calls a
cautious
expansion of the dairy herd.
We do expect to see that expansion probably continue through much of 2021.
Which could send milk output for the year up 1.7%, but send the all-milk price down 3.5%. Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
That leads us right into this week's Milk Lines with K-State's Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning some things we might consider with our early lactation cows. Over the past several years, we have really been trying to reduce the amount of excess nitrogen that we might feed to our lactating dairy herds. And in many cases, the crude protein content of our lactation diets has dropped under 17%. And in some cases, we don't even pay any attention to amino acid balance when we're doing that. There's a recent study from Ohio State University that might cause us to think about this a little bit deeper. What they did in that study is they had a control diet, which was 17% crude protein, not balanced for amino acids, just kind of the typical diet that we might feed on our Midwest dairy farms. Then they had 2 test diets. One, the crude protein content was increased to 20% of dry matter, but only by using soybean meal. The second test diet also was increased to 20% crude protein on a dry matter basis, but it contained a balance of amino acids and also some additional bypass protein. They fed this diet for the first 25 days in milk. And then after that, the animals were all switched to a common diet that contained 17% crude protein, and they followed those animals through 92 days in milk. Here's the interesting thing about this. Those animals that were fed the 20% crude protein diet containing a blend of protein sources and supplemental bypass amino acids actually saw an increase in dry matter intake, and this was both for heifers and cows. In addition, if feeding a 20% crude protein diet early in lactation for the first 25 days in milk resulted in an increase in energy-corrected milk. However, here's the interesting thing. Those animals that were fed the blended protein sources at 20% crude protein for the first 25 days in milk actually yielded more milk through 92 days in milk. That was for the cows. There was no effect on the heifers fed the same diet. So, how do we utilize this on our farms? Number one, if you have a fresh pen, you might really want to think about, are you doing everything you can do to push protein in early lactation within some reasonable parameters? If you're not, you might be missing out on some opportunities in milk production, not only through the first 92 days in milk, but then through the rest of lactation. So, here is my suggestion. Sit down with your nutritional professional and take a look at what you're actually doing with early lactation cows. Do you have an opportunity to utilize a little bit of increase in protein while their intakes are down the first 25 days in milk in order to drive milk production? Keeping in mind that protein quality or amino acid balance is going to be very, very important as you make those decisions. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And this is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Rounding out this Agriculture Today, it again is our weekly wildlife management segment, and aboard once more is former wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. Charlie, you've researched work that looks at the consequences of reintroducing wolves and their predatory tendencies taking over in those locations. What do we know so far about the influence of reintroducing wolves in this matter?
Well, we know reintroduction of large carnivores is controversial. First, there are certainly groups that are not happy about the reintroduction of such species. There's a lot of information that we don't know about their impacts on ecosystems. We know that when we reintroduce those large carnivores in areas where they've been previously extirpated, that we have more opportunities to study and learn about those consequences of reintroductions. We know that human activities and the social tolerance for large carnivores can determine how widely those carnivores are distributed and the abundance of those animals. The adage of lions and tigers and wolves were probably not going to be reintroduced widely across the United States, but perhaps there are some locations where that can occur. But we need to understand what the consequences of those reintroduction efforts might be. So this was a report that was published recently that looked primarily at puma populations or cougar populations up in the area surrounding Yellowstone National Park. The impacts to this greater Yellowstone ecosystem. When wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park in 1995, they very quickly expanded into other landscapes, including down at the National Elk Refuge at the south end of Yellowstone Park. We know that the puma population in that location decreased by 48%.
Wow.
That decrease was explained by three primary causes. One was regulated human hunting of adult and subadult pumas, gray wolves that were killing puma kittens, and the increased starvation across age classes, but especially subadult pumas. So what they did was combine 16 years of monitoring data from 147 individual pumas and their associated survival and reproductive successes, as well as the abundant estimates of pumas, wolves, and prey, which would be elk, in a population model, and then observe patterns of that mortality with declines in puma abundance.
And what did they discover on those observations then?
Well, they had found that certainly you're going to have impacts. Those impacts may not be easily recognized at first, but the elk certainly changed behavior. The elk in that study area are part of that large migratory Jackson herd, which is cooperatively managed by Wyoming Game and Fish Department and the National Park Service, as well as the National Elk Refuge. Portions of that elk herd travel very long distances, but the entire herd congregates near Jackson, Wyoming in the winter, where they receive supplemental feeding by the refuge and adjacent U.S. Forest Service lands and feedlots that are managed by Wyoming Game and Fish. During a time period when wolves were starting to move in, there were hunting opportunities for 2 years, and they also increased hunting opportunities on the elk herd to try to reduce that elk herd from 16,000 in 2000 to 11,000 animals currently. So when they get right down to what the wolves were doing to the puma population, they determined that there were 115 mortalities that they could account for out of the 147 pumas. 18 of those mortalities were from legal hunting. 8 were dropped because those pumas migrated out of the area. Presumably those could be animals that we see as transients in other adjacent states. And then 10 pumas were killed by wolves. Gray wolves were protected during that period of time, all except for 2 years of the study where there was a limited harvest. And this particular study found that increasing wolf numbers had strong negative impacts on puma reproductive efforts. They had negative impacts on subadult survival as well as adult puma survival. Those effects were nearly parallel to what's happening to the elk densities off of the National Elk Refuge rather than the wolves in an earlier analysis that was conducted. So I think wildlife managers suspect changing the elk distributions, or at least in part, explained by increasing wolves in the greater ecosystem, and that elk are seeking to reduce that predation risk by selecting much more open habitat on the National Elk Refuge than they did historically.
So there are clear repercussions of the reintroduction here on certain prey species, including elk. Recent developments, you say, Charlie, make this information actually relevant to the High Plains region of Kansas, perhaps.
Well, I think one of the things that we could learn from this is that when hunting is used as a management tool on subordinate predators in systems with larger apex, perhaps, predators, the population declines can happen very quickly. So I think hunting as a management tool needs to be included and promoted, and that we need to be aware that there may be some negative impacts of these reintroduction efforts on wild populations as well as perhaps domestic livestock.
Once again, that's drawing from a study conducted largely in the Wyoming region, but has something to say about management of reintroduced wolves elsewhere, and it's very interesting to hear just how that plays out in the wild. Charlie, thanks for going over that with us. Charlie Lee, longtime research and extension wildlife specialist at Kansas State University. With that, our time's away for today. On board right here tomorrow, among others, from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McOwen. Roger will take a look with us at emerging tax developments of interest to you farmers and ranchers. Please be tuned in for that and more right here tomorrow. In the meantime, Eric Atkinson here bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.